The smell of burnt circuitry never really left you. Kale Voss had worked the fabrication line long enough that it had soaked into his skin, into the creases of his knuckles, into the lining of his lungs. On good days he told himself it was the smell of purpose. On bad days he knew better. The Theron Collective had come to Earth 40 years ago, not with fire and war the way the old stories always imagined. They'd come with contracts, with infrastructure, with a polished representative named Overseer 7, who wore a body like a tailored suit and spoke in a voice engineered to sound just trustworthy enough. The deal had been simple: labor and resources in exchange for the technology to rebuild the broken cities of the late 22nd century. Humanity signed. Nobody read the fine print. The fine print said the good cities. The clean ones, the ones with working medical systems and filtered air and actual green things growing in actual soil. Those were for the collective citizenry, its shareholders, its partners. The rest of Earth got the fabrication yards, the extraction zones, the recycling belts, where the same material got remade over and over in different configurations. And the people who ran the machines got to watch the lights of the cradle burn above them every night, like a permanent reminder of everything they couldn't have. The cradle was what they called it. A ring habitat, 300 kilometers in diameter, hanging in geostationary orbit above the equator. From the ground it looked like a second moon with ambitions. The Theron lived there. Their human administrators lived there. The medical systems were there. The restoration chambers that could reverse cellular damage, halt disease progression, knit bone back together in hours rather than weeks. If you were collective registered, if you had a valid citizenship chip in your wrist, the cradle would fix anything short of a severed head. If you weren't registered, you got the fabrication line. You got the dust. Kale was 34. He'd been on the line since he was 19, since the youth rehabilitation programs had decided his particular set of talents, namely, being very good at bypassing electronic locks and very bad at getting caught, were better redirected toward productive civic contribution. The foreman at Armaxis Corp., which supplied the collective's military contractors with replacement drone components, had taken one look at Kale's dexterity scores and assigned him to the micro-assembly station. 15 years of threading conductor filament through housings, the size of his thumbnail had made his hands very steady and his patience very short. He'd been late to his shift the morning of the accident. Not by much, 4 minutes, maybe 5, because he'd stopped to buy a mango from the old woman who set up her cart outside the east gate every morning, and she'd been out of change. And they'd spent 3 minutes negotiating a barter that involved a mango, 2 Armaxis-branded meal vouchers, and a promise Kale had no intention of keeping. He'd jogged the last 100 meters to Station 12 laughing at himself, and his supervisor had given him a look that could have curdled milk. And he'd settled into his station still tasting sugar. 2 hours later, the pressure seal on conduit housing 9 failed. The radiation wasn't visible. That was the worst part. In the days afterward, when he had too much time to think about it, there'd been no flash, no heat, no theatrical alarm. Just a quiet alarm light on the panel, a supervisor shouting to clear the station, and 30 seconds in which Kale's body absorbed a dose of ionizing radiation that the Armaxis medical droid catalogued, with the same flat effect it used for everything, as incompatible with continued survival. They gave him the number in days. He preferred not to repeat it. He sat in the Armaxis medical annex for 2 hours after the diagnosis. The droid had offered him a single-use dose of cellular stabilizer, standard issue for contaminated workers, enough to slow the degradation by 40%, and a printed form explaining that further treatment would require collective medical registration, which Kale did not have, and which could not be applied for retroactively under the current labor compact, and which he could appeal through the official petition process, with an expected review time of 8 to 11 months. He'd looked at the form for a long time. Then he'd folded it twice and tucked it in his back pocket and walked out into the afternoon. And the sun had been doing the thing it did sometimes in the late hour when the smog was thin enough, going orange and enormous, filling the whole western sky like it was trying to remind you the planet was still beautiful if you looked at it right. And he'd stood there in the parking yard and breathed in the burnt circuitry air and thought about what he was willing to do. He went to see Ren. Ren Sakadir had been many things across the course of a long and complicated life: a black market medic, a resistance pamphleteer, a 3-time detainee of collective security forces, a terrible poker player, and the most reliably useful person Kale had ever known. She ran her operation out of a converted warehouse in the old transit district, behind a facade that presented itself to collective surveillance as a licensed recycling assessment facility. Inside it was something else. Ren had contacts, networks, a reputation that crossed hemispheres. She moved people, and occasionally information. She listened to Kale's situation without interrupting. When he finished, she turned her chair to face the window for about 15 seconds. Then she turned back. "You know what I'm going to say. You're going to say it'll cost me. I'm going to say it'll cost you everything you have, and some things you don't have yet, and it might not work anyway." She paused. "But I'm also going to say that a man with nothing left to lose is the most useful kind of man I know. And I might have a use for you." The offer was what he'd expected, if he was honest with himself. Ren had been trying for 3 years to pull something out of the Cradle's administrative core. A specific package of override code buried in the system that managed collective resource registration. The code existed because the Theran were, at heart, an intensely bureaucratic species. They'd built in an emergency citizenship reclassification protocol for use in the event of catastrophic habitat failure, a mechanism to mass register survivors and give them access to life support systems. No one on Earth had ever managed to trigger it because it required physical contact with the habitat's primary node, which was inside the cradle, which was accessible only to registered citizens. Ren had been working on that problem. The target was a collective official named Administrator Voss Krail, no relation to Kale, which he found grimly funny, a Theran-human hybrid liaison who carried the administrative clearance codes in an encrypted subdermal implant. Standard practice for high-level functionaries. It meant the codes were literally inside the person. Extracting them required specialized hardware. Ren had the hardware. What she needed was someone to get close enough to use it. "He travels down the gravity tether once a week," Ren said, pulling up a holoprojection of the tether station. "Takes a private transport pod. It lands at the eastern hub. He does whatever it is liaisons do. He goes back up. Window is about 40 minutes. 40 minutes, give or take." Kale looked at the projection. The tether station was heavily monitored. Getting to the transport pod undetected would require bypassing 3 layers of clearance and the extraction hardware. Ren set a case on the table. Inside was a device that looked like an oversized medical injector, matte gray, with an antenna array folded along its side. Short-range data pull. You need skin contact for about 3 seconds. He won't feel it, if that's your concern. My concern is the part where I'm inside a collective security zone with a piece of illegal hardware and a terminal diagnosis. Yes, Ren said simply. That is the concern. He took the case home and set it on the kitchen table and made himself dinner, and watched the cradle come up over the horizon as the sky darkened, that ring of soft white light that people on the fabrication belt called the halo or the leash, or sometimes, in darker moods, the eye. His neighbor's kid, a 7-year-old named Dio, who had decided at some point that Kale was an acceptable substitute for an older sibling, knocked on his door around dusk and asked if he could watch the sunset from Kale's window because it was higher up. "You know it's the same sunset from down there," Kale said. Dio thought about it. "But you can see more of it from here." He let the kid in. They watched the cradle track across the early dark, and Dio asked questions about it the way kids asked questions. Direct, unadorned, expecting a real answer, and Kale gave him the best answers he had. "Yes, people live there. No, we can't go there. No, it's not fair." He said that last one quietly, not really meaning to say it out loud, and Dio absorbed it with the calm of a child who had already figured out that a lot of things weren't fair, and had decided to file that information rather than be destroyed by it. After Dio left, Kale sat with the injector case for a long time. Then he called Ren and told her he was in. The operation went wrong in the particular way that operations without margins for error tended to go wrong. Not all at once, but in a sequence of small complications that stacked. The tether station clearance took 4 minutes longer than planned. Kale moved through the checkpoint zone using a borrowed ID chip that Ren had sourced from a dead man, which was fine right up until the dead man's biometric signature was flagged for a routine audit update, which required Kale to ghost through a secondary scanner at a pace that left no time for the thermal recalibration trick Ren had briefed him on. He got to the transport bay 3 minutes behind schedule. Administrator Voss Krail was already boarding. Kale moved without thinking, which was, on reflection, probably the only reason it worked. He crossed the bay in 12 seconds, identified the administrator by the gate and the administrative sash, and managed to position himself in the crush of boarding personnel well enough to get the injector against the man's wrist for what turned out to be closer to 2 seconds than 3. The device registered a partial pull. He didn't know if it was enough until he was 6 blocks away, walking at a pace that he hoped read as purposeful rather than panicked, and his communicator chirped once. "I have something," Ren said. "How much of something I need to look at? How long? Come in, 2 hours. It was enough." Not everything. The encryption had fractured the data into fragments during the partial extraction. But Ren had what she described, with the controlled excitement of someone who had been trying to do something for 3 years, and was now 3/4 of the way there. As the navigational key. The override code itself was still in the cradle, but now she knew exactly where. "The primary node is in the administrative core," she said. "Sector 8. It's not guarded the way the military systems are, because no one has ever gotten this far before. But it's inside. Inside the cradle. Inside the cradle." Kale thought about what Ren was not saying. "You need someone to go up there." "I need someone who's already running out of time," she said, "and who's good with their hands, and who has spent 15 years learning how Armaxis hardware is assembled, including the hardware they put in the collective security systems, because that's where it goes after the fabrication line." He looked at his hands. 15 years of threading conductor filament. "You'll need to get there first," Ren said. "I have shuttles, not comfortable ones. And I need to tell you something about the procedure." The something was this: to interface with the primary node directly, to force a full habitat-wide override, the operator had to maintain a continuous neural link for approximately 90 seconds. The same kind of link that military-grade Therian field units used for real-time tactical processing. Installing the interface required surgery. The kind that left marks. They did it in Ren's back room, with a medic who had trained in collective facilities, before his registration was revoked for reasons he described only as principled objection, and who had hands steadier than the situation probably warranted. Kale was cautious for the installations because the anesthesia they had access to was the kind that took the edge off rather than eliminated the experience. And he spent most of it thinking about the mango from that morning, about Dio at the window, about the orange sky. It took 4 hours. When it was done, he could feel the interface ports at the base of his skull like a low electrical hum, like the sound a transformer makes in a quiet room. Always there, subsonic, a presence. Ren fitted him with a physical exoskeleton after that. Not military grade, they didn't have that. But a civilian load-bearing frame that she and her engineers had modified over many months to something considerably more than its original specification. Carbon fiber over titanium subframe, actuator-assisted joints, a power cell sewn into the back plate. It was heavy until it wasn't, until the frame read his movement and anticipated it. And then it felt like wearing a second skeleton that simply agreed with everything his first one wanted to do. "You'll have about 6 hours of power," Ren said, checking the seals at his shoulders. 6 hours. You need a lot less than that. You need to get to Sector 8, interface with the node, hold the connection for 90 seconds, and come home. She paused. Or not come home if the 90 seconds gets complicated. He understood what she meant. The interface was designed for Theran neural architecture. Forcing it through human biology for that long would do things to a human nervous system that were described in the technical documentation, in terms that Ren had translated for him as survivable with caveats. The caveats were significant. "The people on the ground," he said. "If this works, all of them, every human on Earth becomes collective registered the moment that code executes. The med chambers on the cradle activate for anyone who uplinks. Emergency medical drones deploy from the habitat's emergency reserves." She met his eyes. "That's a lot of people, Kale." "Yeah," he said. He thought about Dio. "I know." The shuttle Ren used was a converted cargo hauler, rated for atmospheric transit and not much more, with a crew of 4 who had been doing this run, smuggling the desperate and the dying up to the cradle in the hope of reaching a med chamber, for 3 years. They'd lost 2 shuttles to collective interceptors. The pilot, a woman who had introduced herself only as Mira, and who flew with the focused stillness of someone who had made peace with her own mortality, told him this the way someone might tell you the weather. He found it comforting. The cradle grew in the cockpit window as they climbed. Up close, it was more than a ring of light. It was a world folded in on itself, the inner surface visible in segments through the transparent bays, green and blue, and lit with the soft white of engineered days. From down here you could see the curve of it, the way it rotated slowly, generating its own gravity, by the ancient principle of spinning fast enough that the universe forgot it wasn't a planet. Theran interceptors hit them at 40 kilometers from the outer hull. There were 3 of them, small, Fast. The kind that the collective used for what it called population management, and everyone else called something shorter and more honest. They came in delta formation, and the first pass was a warning. A precision burn that took out the shuttle's port thruster and sent them into a controlled spiral that Mira corrected with the expression of someone solving a mildly irritating puzzle. The second pass would not be a warning. Kale had the exoskeleton fully powered. He had the interface hardware primed. He also had, courtesy of Wren's armory, a directed pulse disruptor that had been built from salvaged Armaxis components by someone who understood exactly how they'd been assembled, because they'd spent 15 years assembling them. He knew where the ignition relay was. He'd made 1,000 of them. The shuttle had an emergency airlock rated for pressure suits. It was not rated for what Kale did next, which was to use it at altitude, at speed, with a disruptor and a civilian exoskeleton, to exit the aircraft and attach magnetically to the outer hull. The cold hit first. Not cold the way ground cold felt, but the deep thermal debt of near vacuum, the kind that worked through insulation by simply waiting. His suit handled it. The exoskeleton's joints fought the wind shear and won. The lead interceptor came around for its second pass, at a range of 400 meters, which was close enough for the disruptor and its operator to matter. Kale knew the targeting array would be cycling up. He knew the precise sound it made when it did, because it was the same array they made on Station 12, the same array he'd been threading conductor filament through for 15 years, the same circuit housing with the same weak joint in the relay that always ran a quarter second behind spec no matter how carefully you assembled it. He fired into the relay. The interceptor's targeting array locked up mid-cycle. The craft banked hard to compensate for sudden navigation blindness and overshot the shuttle by 60 meters. The second interceptor broke formation to avoid collision. The third, watching this happen from a range at which it couldn't yet acquire a reliable target lock, executed the combat doctrine fallback that all collective systems defaulted to when their formation fractured. It waited for the formation to re-establish before engaging. Mira had them through the outer hull access corridor in 4 minutes. The cradle from the inside was almost incomprehensibly normal. Not beautiful, not alien, just a place where people lived, where children played on the kind of lawns that didn't exist on the surface, where the air was clean enough that the first breath of it felt like a mild hallucination. Kale moved through it in the exoskeleton, with the interface humming at the base of his skull. And people looked at him the way people looked at anything unexpected in their environment. With the cautious assessment of those who hadn't yet decided whether to be afraid, the collective's internal security forces found him in Sector 4. They were Theran-commanded but human-bodied, most of them. Men and women who had earned their registration through loyalty work, who wore the compact armor of the collective's Civil Enforcement Division, and carried weapons that Kale had also assembled on a different line, in a different year, when he'd been younger and had not yet understood precisely what the components became. There were 6 of them. They moved with the professional efficiency of people who had been doing this for a long time and were good at it. The exoskeleton was not military grade, but its operator had been running on borrowed time for 11 days, which had done something to his understanding of what he was willing to do, and what he was willing to absorb in order to keep moving. He went through Sector 4. He went through the checkpoint at Sector 6. He went through the security lock at the Administrative Core's outer ring, which took 4 minutes and a section of corridor wall, and left the exoskeleton's left arm assembly degraded to about 60% function. Sector 8 was quiet. The primary node was exactly where Wren had said it would be, a central pillar of hardware in a room designed for maintenance access, surrounded by the soft blue light that Theran architecture used the way humans used silence, as an indicator that nothing here required urgency, that this was a room of routine function, that everything was proceeding as designed. Kale sat down against the pillar. He was tired in a way that went past the body. He pulled the interface cable from its housing at the base of his skull and looked at it for a moment. It was a thin thing. It didn't look like anything that should matter. From a long way away, he could hear the collective security forces reorienting. He estimated, between 4 and 8 minutes before they reached him. That was more than 90 seconds. That was enough. He thought about the mango. The specific, unrepeatable sweetness of it, the way the juice had run down his thumb in the morning light, the way the old woman had laughed when they'd negotiated over it. Her laugh, which had been the laugh of someone who had practiced being joyful in conditions that did not reward it, and who was good at it by now, better than anyone had a right to be. He thought about Deo's face in the window. The specific quality of the kid's curiosity. The way he held questions up to the light like they were objects worth examining. He thought about the burnt circuitry smell. He'd hated it for 15 years. He was going to miss it. He jacked in. The neural link was not comfortable. Theron cognitive architecture was efficient and cool and structured in ways that human neurology found deeply illegible. The first thing the connection felt like was a voice speaking a language that the listener's brain was reconstructing on the fly. Every word arriving half a beat after it should. The meaning assembling itself from inference and context, and something that was neither of those things but sat between them. That I think felt like was every piece of data on the cradle arriving simultaneously, which was the kind of experience that the technical documentation had described with the caveats, and which Kale filed under things I will think about later, assuming there is a later. He found the override protocol in the administrative core, the way you found your way around a building you'd never been in, but had helped construct. Not by memory, but by structure, by the logic of how things were arranged when someone who thought a certain way had decided where to put them. Theron administrative logic was consistent. He'd been working with Theron-designed systems for 15 years. He found the protocol. He initiated it. 90 seconds. He held on. It was not smooth. At about 30 seconds, the connection tried to route him out. The system's security, recognizing an unauthorized neural signature, attempting a clean eject. He countered it the way he'd always handled things that tried to shut him out. By finding the piece they assumed he didn't know about, the relay joint that ran a quarter second behind spec, and using it. At 60 seconds, the physical feedback was significant enough that he stopped being able to track it as a separate experience from everything else. At 80 seconds, he became unsure of a number of things he had previously been certain of, including his name, his location, and the difference between the hum of the interface and the hum of his own blood. At 91 seconds, the protocol executed. It ran through the cradle's systems in a cascade. He could feel it, or feel the ghost of feeling it. Every medical chamber registering, every emergency drone queuing for deployment, every registration checkpoint in the system flipping from restricted to open. 3 billion people on the surface below were, in the span of 14 seconds, reclassified from non-registered to collective citizens. The med chambers would be available to anyone who uplinked. The drones were already moving. The connection released. Kale sat with his back against the primary node in the bluelit room and let the silence settle over him. His hands were in his lap. He looked at them. The colloosed fingertips, the crease lines that held the circuitry smell, the steadiness that 15 years had built. He could hear something changing in the cradle around him. Not a physical sound. More an alteration in quality. The way a room feels different when the number of people in it changes, when the balance tips. He'd read once, as a kid, about how certain large radio telescopes could detect the faint temperature difference left over from the beginning of the universe. A few degrees above absolute zero, uniformly distributed. The echo of everything that had ever happened. He didn't know why he thought of that now. Maybe because of the scale of it. 3 billion people, suddenly legible to a system that had been telling them for 40 years that they didn't exist. The security forces found him 4 minutes later. He was still sitting against the node when they arrived. And the one thing that surprised them, he could see it in the particular way their formation shifted when they entered the room and saw him, was that he was waiting. Not braced, not armed, not attempting to negotiate. Just sitting with his hands in his lap, in the posture of a man who had finished what he came to do and had decided that what came next was someone else's problem. The commander of the unit was a woman about his age, with the lean efficiency of long field service and an expression that he recognized as the professional neutrality of someone who had been about to do something and had just had the ground shift beneath it. She had a communicator active on her wrist. Someone was talking to her from somewhere, her formation-held position. She did not give an order. The communicator kept talking. After a moment, she lowered her weapon. He didn't hear what the communicator was telling her, but he understood it well enough. That the situation she had come to resolve was already resolved. That the 3 billion people whose inaccessibility had been the foundation of the collective's arrangement with Earth had, as of 4 minutes ago, become a bureaucratic problem of a scale that the collective's administrative apparatus was not designed to manage. That the med chambers were already receiving uplink requests. That the emergency drones were in atmosphere. That whatever she did to him in this room, the thing was done. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the primary node, and then back at him with the expression of someone updating a map. "Human," she said, not unkindly. "Yeah," Kale said. She stood aside. He walked out. He walked through the cradle in the exoskeleton, with the interface ports at the base of his skull still humming faintly, and the left arm assembly at 60%, and the power cell reading under an hour of reserve. People watched him pass. Some of them looked afraid. Some of them looked something else, a thing he had trouble naming at first, and then recognized because he'd felt it himself once or twice, in moments he hadn't expected. It was the particular quality of a thing that has been told it is not allowed to exist. Reconsidering. Ren had a shuttle waiting at a cargo bay on the habitat's outer ring. Not Mira's, a different one, smaller, clean. Ren herself was on the communication channel when he reached it, her voice carrying the compressed excitement of someone maintaining professional calm over something significant. "Medical drones are in atmosphere," she said. 42 stations in the Eastern Hemisphere are showing chamber access lights. The northern zones are. She stopped. "Kale, are you on?" "I'm on," he said. "Are you walking?" "I'm walking." A pause. The interface. Still got a hum. "When you get back, we'll look at that." He climbed into the shuttle. The pilot, a young man who had the energy of someone who had been waiting in a cargo bay for 3 hours trying not to let his nerves show, pulled them out of the bay and into the transit corridor with practiced efficiency. Through the viewport, he could see the surface of the Earth below the cradle, the sprawl of it, the lights of the cities and the dark between them, the Terminator line moving slowly across the face of the planet. From this altitude, you couldn't see the fabrication yards or the dust or the checkpoints. You just saw the continent shapes and the cloud systems and the geometry of a world that was, as of approximately 14 minutes ago, officially the problem of a bureaucracy that had not anticipated the variable of a dying man with steady hands and nothing left to lose. He pressed his palm flat against the viewport glass. Far below, in the transit district, in the old converted warehouse that presented itself to collective surveillance as a recycling facility, he knew that Ren was already moving, contacting her networks, coordinating the uplinks, making sure that the people who needed meds chambers most got to them first. He knew that, in an apartment several floors above a street that smelled of burnt circuitry and mango carts, a 7-year-old was probably asleep, and would wake up in the morning to a world where the number above his head had changed. He didn't know if he'd get to see any of it. The interface hum was quieter now. That could mean it was settling. It could mean other things. He was too tired to think carefully about which. He leaned back in the seat and closed his eyes, and in the dark behind them, the override cascade was still running. He could feel it like a low tide, like the warmth of something large and slow and irreversible. 3 billion registered citizens. The system updating, record by record, with the grinding momentum of any bureaucracy that had just been handed a fait accompli and had no architecture for refusing to process it. The Theron had built a perfect system. Every component in spec, every relay to tolerance. They just hadn't factored in the man on Station 12, who'd spent 15 years figuring out exactly which joint ran a quarter-second slow, and who'd had nothing left to lose by the time he used it. Kale Voss had been born on Earth, beneath the light of the cradle. He'd worked all his life in its shadow. He thought he'd done enough for one day. Below him, the drones were landing.